Greetings, fellow YouTubers. In this video I want to condense what I cover in my 5-part video series, Solving the Mystery of Dualism, primarily as a courtesy to YouTubers who don't have the time to spend on all 5 videos, but are nonetheless curious about the hard problem of consciousness and dualism. Okay, so what is the hard problem of consciousness? Whether we're talking about dualism or the hard problem of consciousness, the question basically boils down to something like this. Why should it be that the neurological, biological, neurophysical, physical activity occurring in our brains, why should this be accompanied by phenomena of an entirely non-physical mental nature? Phenomena like thoughts, emotions, feelings, sensations, and qualia. How can or why does the activity of these neurons in my brain generate, cause, or produce something as decidedly non-physical as qualia? How do physical things that we can see and touch, produce a phenomenon that is invisible, intangible, diaphanous, and ethereal? This is the hard problem of consciousness. To solve this problem, or to provide an explanation of how physical activity can become our coveted, private, first-person qualia, I'm going to point out 2 obstacles that have prevented us from solving this problem. As I mentioned in my 5-part video series, these obstacles or hurdles are of an epistemological nature. That is, evolution has essentially tailored our brains in a certain way which affects the way we prefer to think. And the way we prefer to think affects our ability to solve the hard problem of consciousness. Hurdle number 1. Our preferred way of thinking about the concept of physical is incorrect. It's incorrect to view the activity occurring in and about active firing neurons as exclusively physical. Yes, the atoms and molecules we learned about in high school and basic chemistry classes were portrayed as hard little bits of inanimate, tangible matter, but this isn't really true. We now know that the outer regions of atoms are populated by electrons, and electrons are not physical things, but dynamic, moving, oscillating swarms or orbitals, zones of electrical presence or potential. We also know that when a neuron fires, it essentially shuttles a zone of electrical charge down the length of its axon. And as Michael Faraday discovered in the 1800s, when electrons move in a conductor, they create an associated magnetic field. Similarly, when a magnetic field changes in some way, it induces the movement of electrons. Lastly, we know that our brains and bodies are basically bathed in a conductive saline solution. So we should readily expect that all of this firing activity occurring in the neurological environment is generating electrical and magnetic fields. It's also believed that a single quale is accompanied not by the firing of a single neuron, but the activity of roughly 100 neurons in very close proximity, in what's referred to as a neural column. We should also expect that the electromagnetic fields of one neuron overlap and affect the fields of another, such that the entire neural column could be envisioned to be surrounded by and imbued with this rather complex, dynamic, oscillating, invisible 3D fabric of electromagnetic or EM activity. I contend that this is the real stuff of importance when it comes to understanding the hard problem of consciousness. Neurophysical activity is not physical in the classical sense of BBs and billiard balls. The neurophysical activity responsible for or that correlates with our first-person experience of qualia is EM. That's the first hurdle. Acknowledging this hurdle presents us with a kind of good news, bad news situation. The good news. The chasm of dualism no longer seems so vast because electromagnetic or EM activity is much closer in kind to qualia than our inaccurate, outdated physical atoms model. Both EM activity and our qualia are essentially invisible, intangible, and ethereal. The bad news. Although we can physically empathize with nanoscopic BBs and billiard balls, we can't empathize with wispy, diaphanous electrical and magnetic fields. Yes, we may be able to rely on Maxwell's equations to tell us how to predict their behavior, but we have no intuitive ability to empathize with them. Okay, now the second hurdle. There is no Cartesian self, no self of experience that does nothing but have experiences. Once we consider that this EM activity is the actual stuff of qualia, the next question is inevitably, Okay, so how does this EM activity in the physical realm become my first-person quale? Is this activity the same thing as my quale, or does it need to now be converted or further processed in some way? And how does it then interact with my mental self, such that I actually have the experience? As I demonstrate in the fourth video of my series on dualism, this line of questioning inevitably leads to an infinite regress. And it goes something like this. Epistemologically, our minds like to think that we consist of a mental self. And this immaterial mental self, we naturally presume, is something like the physical self. It's rather monolithic and singular. It interacts with qualia somehow and experiences or has sensations. So in our minds, we typically start with a vague Venn diagram-like image. We start with a placeholder for our mental self and a placeholder for this qualia thing. Somehow, we imagine my mental self must interact with this qualia in order to actually experience it. So we morph our mental self and envision something akin to mental hands or arms to actually engage it. And when we do, we naturally envision that this results in some kind of new activity that occurs within our mental self. When this internal activity occurs, we reason, then I must experience the quale. But wait a second. As we consider this new image, it occurs that this new activity occurring inside our mental self by itself can't be the end of the road. Because how can some activity, all by itself, both be the experience and the experiencer? No, we probably need one more step here, one more converter, one more input-output device. This module must interact now with this internal activity, and by virtue of its interaction, produces my first-person sensory experience. Yeah, it engages it, and then it produces another activity that represents my actual experience of the quale. And I think you can see where this is going. It's yet another activity that, according to our evolved minds, must have an experiencer. And because we just can't tolerate the idea that activity by itself can be experience, we keep insisting on invoking a haver of the experience, an experiencer. And as long as we do, we inevitably fall into this dreaded infinite regress. It seems that to get rid of this infinite regress, we need to eventually acknowledge that the self must somehow merge, fuse, or become one with experience. The self must be the experience. Said differently, we need to change our mental model such that the self doesn't exist apart from the experience, but during these experiences, I essentially am the experience. Or perhaps even more simply, there is no experiential self. All there is experience. All there is are self-expressing electromagnetic qualia. In essence, I am EM. So, is the hard problem of consciousness solved? I believe it is. To summarize, even though our evolved brains would prefer to envision the neurological environment as being physical, as in the classic sense, it isn't. It's electromagnetic, or non-physical. Secondly, once we acknowledge that there is no Cartesian self, no separate haver of experience, we're free to accept that the unique properties of qualia, the yellowness of yellow and the mintiness of mint, are properties of the EM phenomena coursing about our neural columns, and not the properties of some additional mystical essence that exists in some dualistic, metaphysical, ethereal realm. You are EM, thou art that, Om. Again, as I said earlier, the details of this discussion are covered in my 5-part video series on solving the mystery of dualism, as well as in my book, Evolving Towards the Truth. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Kosmowski. God bless, good night, and drive safely.